cloud. All right, here we go. Okay, we're live. Thanks, Olaf, for agreeing to speak with us on the MELISA technology, which you have been using for quite a number of years. Primarily, I think, for implant rejection issues. So Olaf, thank you as being our speaker today, and I'll let you take the lead.
Okay, so you can see my screen. I shared it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, my name is Olaf Beckord. I'm a chemist, and I'm into clinical diagnostics for more than 20 years. And I'm in contact to the MELISA since 2007, where I met Vera Stejskal, Professor Vera Stejskal, and we implemented the test in our laboratory in Neuss. So first of all, the disclosure, I don't have any income from MELISA or from the in vitro lab anymore, but I was the former technical director and quit the in vitro lab, the laboratory in Neuss, nearly 2 years ago in 2019. And we are the laboratory in Neuss offering the MELISA tests. Thank you for the introduction, Catherine. As you already mentioned, most of our requests or orders for the tests are not by occupational health issues or by workplace monitoring or something like this. Most of them are due to failed implants or to health issue in combination with implants. But of course, this is not new that there is a new ebook published in 2018, and the greatest and most specific methyl exposures occur in certain. Sorry?
Okay, we need to have someone mute their microphone. Just a minute, let me.
And the workers show different symptoms. Most of them are skin reactions or respiratory symptoms, nasal symptoms, fatigue, of course. And the most important metals with respect to occupational health issues are, of course, nickel, which is a very strong and potent antigen. We won't call it an allergen, but it's type 4 irritant. We are chromium, of course, the leather industry and the cement industry, construction industry, cobalt, platinum, and biplatinum in combination with platinum, the platinum group metals. Then some kind of newer antigen for the MELISA test. I developed the test together with Vera in the 2010s. Is methyl methacryclate. We'll come to this later. Of course, there's cadmium, and beryllium wasn't present on the list before we discussed, because the first time I talked to Catherine some months ago, we were discussing the significance of beryllium in Europe, which is quite lower than it is in the US. So to be honest, beryllium is not our most frequently tested antigen. To be honest, it's quite low requests on beryllium because it doesn't have the importance in Europe as it has in the US. So Catherine, I think there's a lot of work to do, huh?
Yes, there's lots of work to do. And just because it hasn't been identified yet in Europe doesn't mean that there's not cases of sensitization and disease. If you don't test, you don't find them. So it's just a hidden problem right now.
So even if occupational or workplace testing isn't in our focus at the moment, funny enough, the MELISA was developed for occupational health screening. Vera Stejskal was employed by Astra Medical, now AstraZeneca. I guess everyone knows this company right now. They had many workers producing these omeprazole, and they had some unclear health issues, and Vera was asked to set up a quantifiable diagnostic test for type 4 reactions with an occupational setup. And this was when the MELISA was born. And even when Vera left Astra Medical, she took the MELISA with her, and she got a patent on the process, on the first step of monocyte depletion. And so this is how she came many years later to Neuss and to set up the MELISA test in our laboratory. There are different tests for the testing on metal sensitization, and the most famous test is the patch testing, and it's called the gold standard. And we know that this is really not adequate for the quality provided by patch testing. So it's simply a different story if we are looking on the biology on the skin with respect to the inner organs and to some implants which are in direct contact to body fluids and to the immune system. But nonetheless, patch testing has quite an importance when it comes to metal sensitization testing, and is always the #1 test to be mentioned. But of course, there are other tests. For example, the proliferation assays we use, most of them are with radioactive thymidine incorporation, which is of course the LTT, and which is the MELISA as an optimized LTT. There are different means, different approaches like flow cytometry, which has the advantage that we can test on proliferation and on activation of the immune system. And there are other non-radiative detection methods, but to cut it down, none of them is right now as sensitive as the radioactivity. And this is the reason why we still stuck on this radioactivity, because it's the most sensitive method. And opposite to the proliferation assays, there are some cytokine secretion assays. The most famous of them is the ELISpot. And they are looking for cytokines, most of them for interferon gamma as a Th1 response, the monitoring of Th1 response to the given antigens. It's somehow sophisticated because, first of all, we need a lot of patient's blood. This is with this set of 4 tubes, citrated blood, 9 ml each, we're able to test on 10 different metals, meaning for an order of 20 different metals, we use to take 6 of these citrated blood tubes. What we do, and I guess it was Donna showing it to us at the last session, is we isolate lymphocytes, and we use this opaque layer of we call it PBMCs. It's mononuclear cells. It's not only lymphocytes, but it's monocytes and lymphocytes. This is the fraction of the blood we use for the test. We do a depletion of monocytes, and we set it up to a specific concentration of blood cells in the medium, which is 1 million cells per milliliter. And contrary to the LTT, we don't use the microtiter plates, but we use macrotiter plates, meaning we do incubation of the cells 1 milliliter, meaning equals 1 million cells per well. And these cell culture is incubated with or without antigens, as a negative control, where we do at least 3 negative controls on each experiment, and 1 positive control with a mitogen. And the antigens are tested in at least 2, most of them in 3 different consecutive dilutions together with the cell culture, with the patient's lymphocytes over 5 days. After 5 days, we add some radioactive thymidine, which is incorporated by the proliferating cells. And after some hours, we do a harvesting, meaning we remove supernatant of radioactive thymidine. We just preserve the cells, and we do some beta counting. And it's direct proportional, meaning the more radioactivity we measure, the higher was the proliferation rate of the cells in our cell culture. And this is done with antigen and without antigen, and so we have a negative control. And every conspicuous result and every result for the negative control and for the positive controls is confirmed by morphology, meaning we are doing a smear out of these cell cultures. We are staining the cells, and we are looking under the microscope for lymphoblasts. And this is what, as you may see, not sure if you see. Okay. If you see these lymphoblasts, this is the reason why it's called LTT, lymphocyte transformation tests. It's a transformation from lymphocytes, from memory lymphocytes, for example, to lymphoblasts. And these lymphoblasts are the indicators for proliferation. So if we find many of these lymphoblasts, it means there is a high proliferation of the cells in the cell culture. What we also see here is looking like some fried egg, for example. These are the monocytes. We need some of the monocytes as antigen presenting cells. But if it is the monocytes proliferating, the macrophages being proliferating, they also incorporate the thymidine, the radioactive thymidine. And this may lead to false positive results as well. And again, this is the reason why we are doing the morphology. In the LTT and the MELISA is, we call it an optimized, standardized, and clinical validated LTT. Part of the optimization is that we use far more cells in each dilution, meaning we are using 1 million cells for every dilution of every antigen. We do a depletion of the monocytes, and by this of the macrophages, because this may lead to false positive results. And we do the morphological control, the morphological confirmation of the positive results, which gives us a second layer of accuracy. And when the results are present, we just write them into these reports, giving the results of the negative control and the results of the positive control, and the numeric results of every dilution of every antigen, meaning we are dividing the radioactivity, the signals, we call it CPM, counts per minute. The radioactivity signal of the dilution is divided by the mean value of the negative controls. And this is the SI value. And if the SI value is above 2, meaning cells proliferated with antigen double in comparison to without any antigen, then we call it weakly positive. If it's above 3, we call it positive, and above 10 is even strongly positive. And as mentioned before, every conspicuous result is confirmed by morphology, meaning we are also writing the results of the morphological confirmation into the report. This is given in the table as quantitative results, and this is given in a graphical way by these graphs. And just to show that the MELISA is not dead, there are newer developments. We try to improve the MELISA any further, not only by setting up and developing testing on new antigens, as we did with the MMAs and with other antigens, but we trying to improve the methodology as well. So we use POCVIT rather than PHA as the positive control. POCVIT is much weaker mitogen than PHA. And the reason behind it is simply that we try to improve and to decrease the sensitivity of the assay. As well as mentioned by PEGI, as far as I remember, last session, we use autologous serum just to get the higher sensitivity or low sensitivity, better. So let's call it the radial sensitivity of the assay. We found out, and Niels also found out some interesting things there. We tried to gain some hours in pre-analytics by using CPDA tubes. It's a mixture of citrated blood and dextroses, for example, which keeps the lymphocytes vivid over a longer period of time. So we tried to expand these 48 hours we used. We have to have for the transport at the maximum. That was not successful because the outcome of the cell isolation is much lower than with citrated blood. So at the one side, we gain more vivid cells over a longer period of time, but we lose them during the isolation of the lymphocytes. And of course, we were keen to have other detection methods instead of radioactivity and the need for license of radioactivity. But until now, we never managed to get a detection method which is as sensitive as radioactivity, unfortunately. And so the consideration, of course, for the MELISA is we need to have the blood within at least 48 hours, but 24 hours after withdrawal in the laboratory to set up the test. We cannot test on patients who are on immune suppressants. So the patients have to quit for these immune suppressants for at least 2 weeks. We say 3 weeks just to be on the very safe side. Patients with low counts of white blood cells, or better of lymphocytes, may not get all the metals tested they request on, because we simply have to few lymphocytes for the test for setting up all these dilutions with 1 million cells. And the results are ready only in 10 days. So it's not really a rapid test, because it all takes time for the confirmation test and setting up of morphology. And these are the metals we are able to test on with our MELISA test in noise. So it's a high number of different metals to be tested. And again, we try to expand to different inorganic substances. Most important thing is, of course, the Lyme antigens against borreliosis, meaning we are testing on 3 different strains of Borrelia. But we are also testing for the methyl methacrylates, and I developed testing on phthalates, but nobody wants to order the phthalates, so it's nearly never requested. We also do test on gluten and gliadin and casein, so we are not limited on metals only. So this is something Dr. Sissel already mentioned, that he's also testing with his LTT on drugs, which is, well, was the first thing Vera developed, was testing on omeprazole. And when it comes to the results, this is the frequency of positive results by the tests requested in our laboratory, meaning that a little bit more than 30% of all ordered nickel tests were positive, weakly positive or positive. Same for cadmium, which is something about 22% of all cadmium tests yield to a positive result. Of course, this is not representative for the population, because if someone orders a test in our laboratory, we are asking him or her to fill a questionnaire when we are looking for possible exposures, and this is done by us. It makes a lot of work, but this is done for us to optimize the testing and the metals to be tested, because sometimes we get some requests for testing on 40 metals, which is not our comprehension of cost-effective testing. And so we are trying to exclude some metals and to focus on the really important metals to be tested by this questionnaire. And so meaning these 30% of positive tests in our nickel testing is some kind of pre-selection due to the questionnaire and to the pre-analytics and to the anamnestic data we collect prior to the tests. So it's not only nickel, how surprising, it's the most frequent positive metal, but it's also platinum with something about 7%. We talked about chromium. The methyl methacrylates is something about 14%, and quite interesting, titanium. We test always on 2 different titanium salts. One of them is titanium dioxide, which is insoluble and reflects the titanium as present in an implant, and we test on titanium sulfate, which is partly soluble and which reflects the titanium ions. Testing on titanium sulfate is positive in 14%. And beryllium is at something about 9%, a little bit below 10%. So we just some examples of metals which are interesting and relevant for occupational exposure. And this is, first of all, is platinum. There was set an exposure limit in 1970, so it's 50 years ago. But still, only a few countries have classified it as a respiratory or skin sensitizer. When it comes to skin tests, prick tests, out of 153 workers, 22 were positive. This is something about 40.4%. And with the MELISA, we find 6% positive reaction to platinum. But of course, as mentioned before, this is not an occupational setup. Cadmium, of course, it's relevant for manufacturing, construction, and there is an expanding industry for recycling of nickel cadmium batteries. We are talking about chronic exposure. This has nothing to do with intoxication of cadmium and cadmium. The calcium in the bone metabolism is replaced by cadmium, which leads to neoplasia in the bone metabolism, which are really painful as Itai disease. But the chronic exposure can result in kidney, bone, and lung disease. There is also a study from 2009 where some young, healthy woman, whatever this means, it was found out there is a link between the development of atherosclerotic plaque and the cadmium level in the body fluid. Cadmium was found with 20% of positive reactions in the MELISA. Newer antigens, methacrylates, it's mentioned before, I developed it together with Vera in 2010, 2012, something like this. Because we were wondering about the replacement of metal fillings. Most of them were amalgam fillings, and we don't have to discuss if amalgam should be removed or not. But most of these fillings were replaced by composite fillings, and the composites are the polymers, and the methyl methacrylates are the monomers of these polymers. And there are still some of these monomers, which are really high reactive substances, are present still and leaking out of the polymers, of the composites. And there were some reports about occasionally sensitization of dental staff with asthmatic reactions or local neurological symptoms, local dermatological reactions, which is not really surprising because they are working with these really, really strongly reactive, highly reactive substances. And retrospective study showed that among nearly 500 subjects, Overall, 10% reacted positive on these methacrylates, and 5%, meaning half of them, were linked to an occupational setup and to occupational exposure. We find more than 14% of our tests on methacrylates positive. We test on 5 different of these methacrylates because it's a big group of substances. Finally, we come to titanium, which is really broad spec spread in our environment and in our daily life by many commercial products. Paint, the white wall paint is titanium dioxide. Sunscreen is titanium dioxide. Some of these sunscreens. It's in cosmetics, in plastic, paper, and of course in food. It is present in wheat flour as a whitener, meaning it whitens up the wheat flour, for example, and has its own E number for as a food supplement. And funny enough, France banned it completely. So meaning you're able to sell titanium containing foodstuff in whole Europe, but not in France. Again, we are talking about these long-term effects, these chronic exposure, which is hard to grasp because there's really only few studies available when it comes to the effect on allergy or sensitization. It is discussed as a possible carcinogen because it showed carcinogenic properties in the animal model. Again, no samples, no studies on this. Yeah, again, very little research on allergy, and but it's more than 13% when it comes to titanium sulfate positive reactions in the MELISA test. The test was developed in 2006 by Liz Valentine-Tone and Kurt Müller because there was simply no standardized valid patch testing. Again, Mayo Clinic tested over a decade, more than 1,000 samples, and never found out a positive result, which is quite unlikely. There was no officially approved in vitro test like the LTT or even the MELISA or cytokine release test as the ELISpot. When it comes to titanium testing, we have to extend the scope because titanium is very often present in alloys together with aluminum, niobium, vanadium. And there may be alternative elicitors which may trigger a sensitization reaction or an allergic reaction, even if it's not the titanium itself. So is what Kurt Müller and Liz Valentine-Tone published in 2006. They had some patients with positive MELISAs, and the health issues improved after removal of the titanium implants. A third of them was negative to titanium testing after the implants were removed, but some of them were also positive to nickel, and nearly every titanium, even if it's so-called pure titanium, contains some traces of nickel, and nickel is a very strong antigen, a very potent allergen. And we know that some of the patients simply react to the traces of nickel present in the titanium implants, and by this don't bear the implants. And the current data says, of course, there are much more positive tests, 30% of nickel, than to titanium with 13%. And this is what it looks like. Here we got some nice monocyte phagocyting the particles of the titanium salt, and this is there is also below it, there is under the monocyte, fed up monocyte, there is a lymphoblast present. And on the right side, the picture we know with nickel salt, because nickel salt is completely dissolved and we don't have any to deal with any particles. And this is the reason why the lymphocytes proliferate. We still are in cooperation with many university institution. Linda already told us at the beginning that we are keen on cooperating with universities. And so these are some of them, as the University Hospital in Brno, where we are looking for cardiology and metal hypersensitivity. Of course, we are cooperating with Lizzie Fireman. Where's Lizzie today? In Tel Aviv. We are participating with the Victory study in the Netherlands, which is a really big study comparing different cellular tests on borreliosis. This is our Lyme test. With the Charles University in Prague, when it comes to metal hypersensitivity and failed orthopedic implants in the US. When it comes to galvanic corrosion, very interesting thing. Patients having different metals inside the body, and the current flowing between these metals. We have a big study with Els Bayer in the Netherlands when it comes to sarcoidosis. We always were supported by Lizzie as well, Lizzie Fireman as well. And last not least, the Amsterdam University Medical Center, good old friend Niels, who published a paper last year, as far as I remember correctly, where he compared MELISA results to other LTTs and also to a flow cytometry. Yeah, that's it. Big thank you to you. And if there are any requests or further information needed, just contact me on olafbeckord@invitalab.de. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Olaf. That was really a great talk, and I learned quite a bit. So it's great. I'm gonna open up for questions and answers, and then I have a few questions of my own. So okay, Dr. Cullinan.
Olaf, thanks very much. I really found that very interesting. How does it compare with patch testing?
Sometimes good, of course. This is what Niels also did at the Amsterdam University Medical Center. There are antigens which are in nearly absolute concordance with the patch testing. For example, nickel is not a problem at all. It's really good. And good correlation. Mercury, most of it as well. I've never heard of a really good titanium patch testing. It seems that titanium is really some antigen which is not good at patch testing, but good at MELISA testing. So to answer your question, I would say it depends on the antigen.
Okay, Dr. Zissel.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Cullinan. Did you have something else to say?
Sorry, presumably, Olaf, you don't know anything about beryllium.
Yeah, that's
unfortunately not. No.
We did some analysis in parallel. So we did patch tests for beryllium sulfate and the LTT. And the problem is that, for example, beryllium, if you use beryllium sulfate, which is very good soluble, but it's irritating because it is acidic. So every time you have a reaction, but not necessarily a granulomatous reaction. So it's very difficult to explain to patients that it's just irritation, but it's not a positive test. So, and the second point is that there are reports that skin sensitization also leads to positive LPT results afterwards. So yeah. Patch test for beryllium might not be a good idea.
Yeah, thank you for this, because I have to smile because we had a lot of slides prepared for the difference between patch test and LTT testing. And one of the main criteria against patch testing in general, let's call it like this, is that it is not able to distinguish between sensitization and irritation.
Right.
and there is something called angry back syndrome, where the whole back of the patient is red, inflamed, and the patient is sensitized, as you mentioned, the patient is sensitized by the patch test.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay, Dr. or Ann Gell? Gell?
Hi, this is Ann Gale from the ORISE Beryllium Lab in Oak Ridge. I was wondering if you had a minimal amount or percentage of lymphocytes that you require after you've isolated the mononuclear layer before you set up culture.
Of course, this is limited by the numbers of antigens or of metals, or however you will call it, to be tested, because we need 1 million per milliliter, and meaning we need at least 3 million cells for the negative controls. We need at least another million for the positive control. And then it comes to the antigens and how many dilutions of the different antigens we use. We are able to set up a MELISA test with less than 1 million, with 0.8 million, meaning 800,000 cells per milliliter, but this is the absolutely limit, because on the other hand, we would lose sensitivity.
Do you have a percentage of the cells that have to be lymphocytes? Do you have a criteria for that?
No, we don't have a criteria. We go into the total number of the lymphocytes.
Okay.
This is limited by the numbers of metals. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Dr. Zissel?
I do have a lot of questions. So,
Okay. Well, I'll let you have the floor for a while. Let me just say that.
first of all, just a methodological question. How do you count the morphology, or do you count the morphology, or is it just have a look and see whether there are lymphoblasts instead of only lymphocytes?
No, we do these standardized blood smears. This is done by a cytocentrifuge. So it's a defined spot of area. Yeah. And we have a cutoff value of 5 lymphoblasts in the spot. Yeah. Above 5, it's called weakly positive, and above 8, it's called positive.
It's done by a technician, or do you have?
It's done by a technician.
Okay. I frequently read that you reduce the amount of monocytes in your lymphocyte cultures. I really don't understand the rationale behind. You said about possible proliferation, but proliferation of monocytes is extremely low, so they do not proliferate. Macrophages alveolar macrophages may divide by chance, so about 2 to 3%, but monocytes, I never heard that monocytes proliferate.
It's thank you for clarification. It's the macrophages, of course, and it depends on the antigens, because we're always trying to use really completely soluble metal salts. This is one of the slides was a comparison of the slide of titanium testing and the slide of nickel testing. And these macrophages are triggered by particles, and phagocytosis of these macrophages is triggered by particles. And so especially when it comes to not completely dissolved antigens, we see sometimes the proliferation of the macrophages, and by this, of course, incorporation of radioactivity. There's one antigen, it's gadolinium, which is used as an contrast reagent for X-raying, for X-raying, I guess. And we were always keen, and Vera was very keen to get a test on gadolinium, because it's clinically significant, and many people react on these contrast reagents. but we never managed to get an LTT because it was always an MTT, because the whole layer, when you do a slide of these cell cultures with gadolinium, the whole layer was flooded by monocytes and by macrophages. Never seen this again. So it was not an LTT we did, but it was an MTT we did. And by this, we can't, I'm not able to do an LTT on gadolinium because somehow it triggers the monocytes or the macrophages.
And maybe the last question, you report on loss of reactivity within a few months, and that also puzzling me. At least in beryllium, when we did, when we start with to set up the LTT, we always compare a patient with a volunteer. So they had to be negative for known allergies. But by chance, we found two persons, I wouldn't say patients, but two persons who were repeatedly positive for beryllium in the beryllium LTT. And when we asked them, so they may have had beryllium contact one at least 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So the reactivity persists over years. So I'm wondering, how is it possible that these cells, which may react to titanium, are removed within months? Do you have
this is interesting because it's contrary to our experiences. For example, myself, I was tested weekly positive on mercury when we started with MELISA, and because I had some mercury film still, or amalgam fillings, and they were removed by my dentists, and it took about half a year. And the mercury signal, my mercury reactivity went down below the cutoff value. Yeah, and this is what we found quite often with Lyme disease and with a replacement of implants, is that the response in the MELISA test is decreasing, and within several months, let's say half a year or even more, is getting below the cutoff value of 3 or 2. So I was wondering about the results of your patient or your perception.
Okay, there's a report by Fontenot and colleagues. They report on different activation stages of the lymphocytes. Yeah. So if you have effector memory cells versus central memory cells, maybe if you have a switch within these subpopulations, you may have a switch in reactivity. But per se, lymphocytes are long-lasting or long-living cells normally. So if you have memory cells, you have positive results. You should have positive results for more than half a year.
Yeah. To be honest, we just monitor proliferation of lymphocytes. Yeah, we don't know what kind of effector cells, of memory cells, is reacting in this case, and this is something we are trying to focus on for the next future. Is we are very keen to get more information out of this test. Of course, we are trying to set up a non-radioactive test. This is the most important for us because, for example, you won't find any MELISA labor in France because French laboratories don't use radioactivity for the tests, and so
don't use radioactivity.
Yeah, and so we are on the way setting up some doing investigations with a good partner for flow cytometry, and we try to get even more information about the specificity of the cells we are using, about the outcome of the cells which are proliferating, and we are doing. We are able, this is one of the advantages of the flow cytometry, I guess you know, because you are doing flow cytometry as far as I remember, that you can do proliferation as well as activation.
Yeah.
And so we are just at the beginning of this, and we are hopefully we come into cooperation and to have the time and the money to set up, for example, flow MELISA, something like this. And of course, are we discussing, and Catherine also triggered me with one of the former meetings of the beryllium solutions meeting was simply that there was a flaw with proliferation testing when it comes to CBD, as far as I remember, Catherine.
Yes, there was Dr. Maroney at Los Alamos attempted to do flow cytometry, but we never saw, final validated tests with that. So to me, especially since I'm not an immunologist, and it's not something that I would feel comfortable doing, sending somebody to a lab that does flow cytometry yet. This is my opinion. So why? Because I haven't, it's like, have they self-validated, or who has validated the method? I haven't seen anybody really use it on enough, I think, to feel confident in the results. So.
We did a small study on flow cytometry proliferation tests, and I was not really convinced. So I didn't like it. We don't see really good results compared to the conventional LPT. But now, we did it a long time ago, but now there are better fluorescent dyes, maybe, because the problem is that if you bring in a dye within the cell, it may be toxic, depending on the dye, depending on the concentration. So you have a dye which slows down the proliferation, and you have so less cells proliferating. So that is really difficult. So you need fluorescent dyes which are really good, non-toxic, but very good in stability.
Yeah,
and that's a problem.
I think really the critical point there is getting to the same sensitivity as radioactivity. Radioactivity, we know this from other clinical tests, is one of the most sensitive methods. So what I hope at least to gain with testing on flow cytometry is to get a better understanding of the cells which are reacting, to see which kind of lymphocytes. We just count lymphocytes. It's nothing about the function of these lymphocytes. And so what I hope at least to get is some additional information on the lymphocytes reacting in the MELISA. Of course, I'm hoping to get a sensitive method where we can replace the radioactivity with, but I'm not sure about if we ever manage to get this.
Okay, so Lisa Barker has a few messages in the chat box. I don't see your microphone, Lisa. Do you want me to say? I'll just go ahead and say, she said beryllium deposition deep in the lung is likely permanent. Is perhaps different than other metal exposures. And also some of these other metals are not type 4 sensitizers, so we may not be able to make comparisons between the metals.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good points, Lisa.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah. So I would like to just ask you a few questions. Can you comment on the availability of tritiated thymidine?
It's quite easy to get in Germany. We talked about this in one of our chats ago. So we simply order it and it's delivered without any problem, because we're not the only one performing whatever tests with proliferation tests with radioactive thymidine. I can't judge on any other country. I know that the Swiss laboratory is doing it without any problems. I've never talked to our colleagues in Spain, for example, about the possibilities too. And maybe I should add that radioactivity by this thymidine is so low that we don't even need a special license for radioactivity testing. You know, in my Cologne laboratory, in the Cologne laboratory I directed, there was some department for nuclear medicine, and they did radioimmunoassays, and we had a special license with special occupational health screening and with dosimeters, and this is not necessary for the amount of thymidine we use within 1 year in noise.
Okay, so you buy that just from a, you know, chemical supplier then?
Yeah, exactly.
In Germany, which
Yeah.
could they could ship across borders?
I'm quite sure they will.
Okay. So then I wanted to talk and just bring up the topic so other people could comment, not me in specific, is that you list a stimulation index of 2 for all of the metals. And I have heard comments from others that say, well, nickel has a much more is more reactive. And so, I mean, I don't know if there's some thought to maybe weighting based on the metal, the different stimulation index. So could anyone else have interest in commenting on that? No takers? Okay.
Catherine?
Yes.
I think maybe one thing too that also hasn't been mentioned is obviously the concentrations of metals used in the LTTs will matter. So when the MELISA test was discovered, they knew that if they used a high enough mercury concentration, then anyone tested for mercury would show proliferation. So that's obviously not clinically relevant. So you need to set the concentrations of metals used so they are not mitogenic, they're not toxic, and they will only stimulate the exposed symptomatic individuals and not just anyone exposed. So maybe that's not quite your answer, but that's just something to consider maybe.
Yeah, that is a good point. I'm wondering if maybe we could maybe develop a table on what, you know, specific issues, like what lab uses what, since, you know, stimulation index, what are the concentrations that are tested, what's the positive control test material, that I think that might be able to help us understand a little bit about, you know, how broad of a differences these tests have, and then maybe we can kind of like tighten up. And as Lizzie said, maybe have some sort of standard method. So Lisa said that they use an SI for nickel at 5.7. Okay. And Dr. Zissel, did you have a question?
No, I just want
Okay.
to add to the mention what Linda mentions. So it also depends on the cohort where you do the test. We use the LTT to differentiate between sarcoidosis and chronic beryllium disease. So we have patients, they are sick, they have activated T cells. So we don't rely on a fixed SI to differentiate what is positive or negative. We always test the background proliferation. Sometimes the patients don't show any proliferation, it's very low. But there are some patients with very high, they come with a very high spontaneous proliferation of the T cells. So an SI of 2 wouldn't help us. So we define an individual SI. We define what is the mean proliferation, what is the, so we do a lot of tests just to get this individual SI, because we do 16 wells without any stimulation, just to have a mean and a standard deviation to calculate what is an individual's cutoff.
Okay.
And
So
that-
how reactive they are.
Right.
Yeah, interesting.
Value that varies between 1.8 to 3 something. So there's a high difference because they don't have any conditions which may induce proliferation, or they have a treatment which slows down the proliferation. So we have to, yeah, if you use a fixed cutoff, I think we would go wrong.
Okay. Well, and especially since, as you mentioned, your clientele is patients. They are very sick,
Right.
very ill, frank disease.
Going back to one of our meetings, that is what I see, which is different to that what the colleagues in the US do. They have workers. Yes, they're not sick. They have a positive test, and then they look whether they are sick or not. We have sick patients, and then we look, is it beryllium disease or is it sarcoidosis? And that makes a difference, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess it's a different setup for you, huh?
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so before our next meeting, I'll start a spreadsheet that has just a list of test parameters. And then I'll figure out a way that we can share it, or you can send me the information individually and I'll load it into one master document. So let's see, I also had I guess a comment to say that I know that we don't have like worker studies in Europe yet, but maybe there's other alternatives. What if we were to, have not just be doing testing for beryllium, maybe the more likely way that we can get this test available in Europe is to use nickel or some other metal that there's maybe more awareness of.
Yeah.
So I know that the Nickel Institute is working on an exposure study. Stephen Varpale is going to be collecting a lot of air samples, and it may be that they would find an interest in doing some sort of proliferation testing for nickel workers. What are your thoughts? Anybody have an opinion of like focusing a little bit more on a broader suite of metals?
I think it's hard to generalize to say it's nickel or something like this. Of course, you will find the highest number on positive reactions when you test on nickel. Of course, this is what we are doing with the MELISA. We are just asking questions in order to find out the possible exposures. And then we give the recommendation of, well, let's say test on titanium, for example, because there's some titanium plant. The ubiquitary and nickel is a very potent antigen, of course. So.
Okay.
And again, it is a question of the purpose of your test. So as I am working in a pulmonology setting, I have to say I'm not interested in nickel testing. That's not our point. Our point is beryllium, and sometimes it's aluminium, but not nickel. That doesn't produce a lung disease. It's a skin disease. Maybe we should ask the dermatologist. So yeah.
Well, it causes asthma. So it's not, yeah. So there is some sort of reaction, but of course you pick it up if somebody has asthma, right? So, but you're right. There's not the long-term debilitating
possibilities to test nickel allergies, and that's mainly, I think, the main point. So the dermatologists use other tests to look for sensitization
for skin issues. Okay. All right.
And I also would what I said at the beginning, relevance, beryllium is not relevant. I don't agree with that. So we
Sorry, then I was wrong. Explained it. Beryllium is relevant, but it doesn't have the importance in Europe, as far as I know.
It hasn't been discovered, and this is very true
Yeah.
because, you know, I've spoken to quite a number of even researchers in government organizations from occupational health, and they'll say, well, we don't have a problem. We have 12 people here that are sick.
But it's not relevance, it's awareness. That's the point.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, it was awareness. Thank you, Gernot.
Right. There's not, or the level of understanding, you know. There's just not, it's not there.
It's the largest importer of beryllium, maybe France now, due to the
ITER project.
Right, but it was at least, it is one of the most important importers of beryllium. So we have a lot of beryllium inside, but we don't have awareness that it may be. I had really strange talks to people working with aluminium containing a lot of beryllium. They didn't know that it may cause a disease.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yes, this is true. This is what we're doing here to try and educate and inform occupational health professionals and hopefully make change in Europe with regards to regulations. The only thing that's going to start it is a study, though. And so I still, you know, feel a little bit inadequate at trying to figure out how to get this accomplished in a kind of, to me, in a foreign land. I mean, I think I could probably do it a little bit easier in America, but here it's just it's kind of a little hard to navigate the governmental issues that I'm just completely unfamiliar with, really. So I was thinking for our next meeting, we'd have another guest speaker. So Lizzie was going to speak today, but she had a personal commitment that she felt she wouldn't even be able to come to the meeting. So I invited her first, and then also Dr. Zissel. So I don't know if we would have two, or if maybe we just have one. And so any thoughts on this?
Maybe one is enough, as it was today, right?
It does. It's a nice time frame. We went over it thoroughly, I think, and we're not rushing. So, okay, so there'll be one talk next week, and then also on my list of things that I want to see us talk about is the difference between patch testing versus the LTT. Maybe that would be a good discussion.
Yep.
And you know, it would be nice to have somebody on board who is really familiar, like they do patch testing all the time. So anybody have any knowledge of someone that could like give a talk on patch testing? That would be good. Okay, well, I am going to stop the recording.